An undesigned coincidence is an instance when you have one or more independent historical accounts and they interlock in such a way that would be unexpected if the story were simply fabricated wholesale. The Bible, and particularly the Gospels, tell the same story but in different ways. We have 4 Gospels and they're not written exactly the same. Otherwise, we would only need one of them. They have a different angle on the life of Jesus. And the only miracle, other than the resurrection of Jesus, that is found in all 4 Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000. So this works as a really good test case for us to figure out, are there independent historical details here that interlock in a way that communicates unforeseeable validation to the truthfulness of the story? If these really were written at a later time by later individuals who weren't actually there, then are there details that we can look at that can corroborate this? And the answer is yes. Now, where all 4 Gospels tell this story, 3 of the 4 mention the grass. Kind of a funny thing to mention. John gives us the detail that there was much grass, very helpful. And Mark goes further and says, but the grass was green. I want to show you a picture of the particular geographical location that this story took place. And what you notice there is that the grass is not very green. And this is true for most of this area. Now, here's a graph that's taken some of the climate research that looks at the rainfall chart for the nearby town of Tiberias. It's just on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and they're approximately 20 kilometers from each other. Now, between the years 26 and 36 AD, all possible dates for the time when the miracle probably happened is between the last day of March and the end of April. So if this event really took place at the time recorded, we should indeed expect that after the 5 most significant months of precipitation, the grass would have been green. But you might ask, Wes, how do you know? How can you coordinate the time? Well, that's another one of our undesigned coincidences, because Mark explains that Jesus went to a remote location in order to get out of the way of the crowds. He writes, and Jesus said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat." Now, this involves Jesus getting into a boat and then going to a quiet place, saying no more about the idea that the people were moving about a great deal. However, John, and John alone, records the time this took place. He says, "Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand." Now, this is not an insignificant piece of information, because the Passover is the biggest Jewish festival of the year, when the largest amount of pilgrims would have traveled to Jerusalem to attend. John records nothing about the crowds traveling, and yet it is precisely the festival in John that would explain the detail in Mark about the people traveling in much numbers. In Mark, the fact that Jesus moved locations indicates that it was not a mere increase in traffic for a few hours, but a more prolonged increase in a movement of people such as normally occurred only at festival times. And it's here that we have our undesigned coincidence. John explains a puzzle in Mark. And yet, according to almost every scholarly opinion, Mark was written first. Immediately after mentioning the Passover, John says this, "Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, 'Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?'" Now, I'm going to ask a question that I know is all on the top of your minds. Why did Jesus ask Philip? Worry no more, I'm going to explain it to you. If you think about it, even though that seems like a funny question, Philip is not necessarily the most ideal character. He's not the first character you would think of for Jesus to ask, because he's not one of, the key, Peter, James, and John, the leaders of the group. We also know that Matthew in the Gospels is said to be the tax collector, so he has an awareness of the economic goings-on of this particular area in Galilee. He would have known how much bread would have cost, so that when, they got their kosher lattes at Starbucks, then he knew they would have had no money left. And then Judas is said to have been in charge of the money bag. So there are other likely candidates for Jesus, if we just kind of think about it at face value, to have asked. But in order to answer this question, we need to leave John and go over to Luke. On their return, the apostles told him all they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. When the crowds learned it, they followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing. So whereas John tells us the who, Luke tells us where. It's in Bethsaida. Now, if we go back to John, earlier in John, we see a passage that's very interesting. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." Why did Jesus ask Philip? He was a local. So let's put the pieces together. Both John and Luke tell the same story. Luke doesn't mention Philip in the context at all, but Luke does tell us the location of the event. John doesn't mention Bethsaida as the setting of the miracle, but does tell us that is where Philip is from. So why did Jesus turn to Philip? He was a local. But it is only by putting them together that we can understand why Jesus speaks to Philip in John chapter 6, verse 5. John explains the many traveling in Mark, and Luke explains the dialogue in John. Even the detail in John that the boy had barley loaves, which is John chapter 6, verse 9, fits nicely with its nearness to Passover, which is immediately after the barley harvest. All of these details come into view when we read the Gospels together, when they tell same stories, but they have different details. This is not corroboration in terms of four individuals getting together and saying, okay, let's get our story straight. These are details that you wouldn't include if you were making them up. And note that none of these undesigned coincidences touches directly on the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. So one might therefore be inclined, a skeptical historian, to claim that the setting was realistic, but not the miracle. The miracle, someone might argue, arose as the story was told from one person to another and was exaggerated. But the problems with treating the central part of the story, the miracle, as careless exaggeration is that the undesigned coincidences suggest careful transmission of peripheral details. If transmission of the major elements of the story have been careless in their passing on, we should not expect the minor elements to be preserved so well. And we should not expect the different stories to fill in the gaps. There's much grass. The grass is green. Why is that? Because it's Passover, and because in that particular season it would have just been after the rains. And for a boy to come and have a barley loaf makes sense because just after Passover was the barley season. And why does Jesus ask Philip? Well, because he was a local, but we only know that by reading the stories in tandem together and putting the details together like a puzzle. The idea that the miracle account arose through careless exaggeration involves an unrealistic process of selective corruption of information in the story. And you know what don't have undesigned coincidences? The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, nowhere in sight. You can't corroborate them in the same way that you can with the Gospels and Acts.